Hi, good afternoon, Nelson. Thanks for making time to speak with us today.
My pleasure, Scott. Thank you.
So, why don't we start off with you telling us a little bit about yourself and your practice?
Okay, sure. I think as most chapter members know, I'm not from Hong Kong. My wife and her family are, so I'm a trailing spouse. I was born in the US, in New York, grew up there, went to school in Boston, and worked there for nearly a decade. Then around the mid 80s, we were called back to Hong Kong. My father-in-law, Clifford Wong, who was an architect and developer, tragically has serious illness. We came back to spend a few months with him before he passed away. He was only in his early 50s and had ongoing development projects in the new territories. One of them, Ferry Park in particular. It's a new town, population of 20,000, low-rise housing, commercial town center, country club, schools, kindergartens, church, even its own post office and fire station. So that's the development that's larger than the town that I grew up in, New York. So we had the challenge of completing that project, which we figured would take us about 4 years, which we were able to do. And then instead of going back to the US, which was our original plan, we ended up staying in Hong Kong. I think that's a familiar story for many members of our chapter. Right, regarding my practice, I represent the third generation of a firm that was started in 1947. So my wife's grandfather, who was an engineer, practiced on his own for about 15 years. Then my father-in-law joined him in the early 60s. He became a developer. And so they practiced really as a kind of an in-house A&E firm for nearly 40 years. Since I've taken it up, it's been transformed into more of a design-driven studio practice with institutional clients. So by the end of 2020, I will have been leading this firm for another 35 years.
So, you've been through a number of downturns and crises. Can you describe some of the challenges that you faced individually, but also as a firm during that period?
As we had discussed one time previously, looking back on my working life in Hong Kong, it seems like it's in nonstop crisis management. We came in the early 80s when Hong Kong was just emerging from a long slump. That was also layered with the political uncertainty leading up to the handover. I recall at the time, half a dozen banks got bailed out by the exchange fund. And then arriving in Hong Kong, not being familiar with practice or language, culture, needing to get qualified right away, becoming an AP. So it's pretty much sink or swim. And then in the early years, 1989, we had Tiananmen, right? 97, we had the handover. 98, Asian financial crisis. 2003, SARS. 2008, the global financial crisis. So ironically, the last decade or so has been relatively stable relative to those earlier events until now, when we have both the social protests in Hong Kong followed by the pandemic. I think at every step of the way, whether you're starting out in practice or you're mid-career, or you can look back on several decades of practice, it's always a challenge, struggle to stay afloat.
As we talk about this now, I kind of feel like the last decade is the anomaly, and not
Yes.
not all the difficulties. I've quite
Yes.
forgotten about a few of these events. I think we're facing about the worst disruption that I've seen in 30 some odd years of practicing. Looking back on the experience that you've had in these past disruptions, do you have any advice for young firms or young architects going forward?
Yeah, I think regardless for young firms or established practices, we're facing a common challenge. Let me first say, I think Hong Kong's response to the coronavirus has been exceptional in terms of full number of cases, fewer local community transmissions. Unfortunately, only 4 fatalities compared to when we had SARS in 2003. There were nearly 300 fatalities. But in terms of economic impact, this is worldwide, unprecedented. Unemployment in the US within 2 months' time only. So I think the period for recovery is going to be very extended. And there's the concern of the virus coming back in the end of the year with cold weather. So, it's easy to say hope for the best and plan for the worst. I think what's really essential for all our practices is protecting our most essential assets and our most lasting investment, which are our people. Trying to keep things in a practice stable to keep everyone on. So many years ago, I made the decision I didn't want to have a very large practice, studio size firm where I could be involved in all steps from concept to construction. As a smaller firm, you can be selective about the work you take on. You don't have to just take on projects for the salary and the overhead. So my problem is a lot easier than for a firm that has 300 staff. That's a different proposition altogether. So I think most firms that are starting out small and just try to keep that core together. It's easy to say, hard to do, but it's really essential to keep enough finances to keep everyone afloat, even when there isn't enough work to keep everyone busy. And it'll pay off in the long term, because otherwise, if you lay off staff, then you have to rehire, you have to retrain. That's a costly exercise, and you lose institutional knowledge in your firm as well. So I've made my own sort of practice to keep at least 12 months salary and overhead in reserve in the firm, so that even though we had no work whatsoever for a year, everyone could stay together. I guess it's worked. The average tenure of my staff is 18 and a half years. My senior associates have been with me 25, 30 years. So the benefit is, we're practicing like a basketball team. Throw a no-look pass. Someone will pick it up at the other end, and that's a great benefit to have in any consultancy practice.
I think that's good advice for any firm, really. So Nelson, thank you very much for making time for us today.
Yeah, great. Thanks so much for having me.